Good morning. This lecture video is going to look kind of specifically at the nervous system control of muscle tension, explaining concentric, isotonic, and eccentric contractions, looking at the length-tension relationship, the three phases of the muscle twitch, and then wave summation, tetanus, and trepi. So we know from the previous lecture videos that to move an object, which is referred to as a load, the sarcomeres in the muscle fibers of the skeletal muscle must shorten. And this force that's generated by the contraction or the shortening of the sarcomere is called muscle tension. However, muscle tension is also generated when the muscle is contracting against the load that doesn't actually move, resulting in two main types of skeletal muscle contractions: isotonic contractions and isometric contractions. Isotonic contractions is going to be those activities where the tension in the muscle stays constant and the load is actually moved as the length of the muscle changes. Okay, so isotonic is going to lead to movement. There are two categories of isotonic contractions: concentric contraction, and this is going to be when the muscle shortens to move a load, and eccentric contraction when muscle tension actually decreases and the muscle lengthens. So the best way to think about isotonic contractions is look at this graphic of an arm curl. If you are doing an arm curl, say that you're starting with your arm all the way down and you're curling your arm up with your weight, okay? That bicep muscle, think of your bicep muscle, shortens in order to move that weight and bring it towards your shoulder, right? So the angle of your elbow is decreasing. There's movement that's occurring as that bicep shortens. Now, as you go back down then to bring the weight back down to the starting position, your muscle, your bicep is lengthening and the tension is shortening. There's still movement that occurs. The angle of your elbow is actually increasing, right? We've moved the weight back down to our starting point, but the muscle actually lengthens versus when you curled it up, the muscle actually shortened. So those are the difference between an isotonic contraction. And let's just say in this example, we're using a weight that's 5 pounds to do our arm curl. In an isometric contraction, we're going to use a weight that's 500 pounds, and we're going to be trying to move it, but we cannot generate enough force to actually move the weight. We're still producing tension. Our muscles are still contracting, but there's no actual shortening or lengthening that's occurring because we cannot generate enough of a contraction to actually move it. So we're kind of like generating a muscle contraction without generating any kind of movement. The angle of your elbow is going to stay the same because we can't generate enough force to move things. Now, most of the actions of your body are a result of a combination of isotonic and isometric contractions that work together to produce a whole wide range of different outcomes. All of these different muscle activities are under the control of the nervous system. So neural control regulates concentric, eccentric, and isometric contractions. It regulates muscle fiber recruitment, and it regulates muscle tone. A crucial aspect of nervous system control of skeletal muscle then is the role of motor units. Every skeletal muscle fiber must be innervated by the axon terminal of a motor neuron in order to contract. So here's our motor neuron here, and these are all the different axon terminals, and they're going to innervate or connect with a muscle fiber. Each muscle fiber is innervated by only one motor neuron, but the actual group of muscle fibers in a muscle innervated by a single motor neuron is called the motor unit. So all of the different groups of muscle fibers here that are supplied by this motor neuron is called the motor unit. The size of a motor unit is variable depending on the nature of the muscle and what its function is going to be. They put motor units into two categories: a small motor unit, so that's going to be a single motor neuron that supplies a small number of muscle fibers in a muscle, and a large motor unit, which is a single motor neuron that supplies a lot of muscle fibers. Now, because we have these different sizes of motor units, there's a wide range of motor units within many different skeletal muscles, and this gives the nervous system a wide range of control over the muscle. The small motor units in the muscles are going to have a smaller, lower threshold motor neurons that are more excitable. They'll fire first to the skeletal muscle fibers, and they tend to be the smallest. Activation of these smaller motor units result in relatively small degrees of contractile strength or tension generated in the muscle. As more strength is needed, then larger motor units with the bigger, higher threshold motor neurons are enlisted to activate larger muscle fibers. And this increasing activation of motor units produces an increase in the muscle contraction, and this is called recruitment. As more motor neurons are recruited, the muscle contraction grows stronger. And in some muscles, the largest motor units may generate a contractile force of 50 times more than the smallest motor unit within that muscle. And this allows a feather to be picked up by using the bicep brachii arm muscles with minimal force, and a heavy weight, going back to the other slide, an arm curl, to be picked up by the same muscle because it can recruit these larger motor units. So recruitment is just going to be, again, this idea that we are recruiting more units in order to generate more force. And between the action of the small motor units and the large motor units, our body can generate just the right force needed to move an object. So we know that during a muscle fiber contraction, the myosin and the actin form cross bridges, and they overlap each other. And these cross bridges can only form where thin and thick filaments already overlap, so that the length of a sarcomere is going to have a direct influence on the force generated when the sarcomere shortens, and this is called the length-tension relationship. The ideal length of a sarcomere to produce maximal tension occurs at about 80% to 120% of its resting length, with 100% being the state where the medial edges of the thin filament are just at the most medial myosin heads of the thick filament. So this length is going to maximize the overlap of actin binding sites in myosin heads. If a sarcomere is stretched past this ideal length, so beyond about 120%, thick and thin filaments do not overlap enough. And this is going to result in less tension being produced. If a sarcomere is shortened beyond 80%, the zone of overlap is reduced with the thin filament jutting beyond the end of the last myosin head, and it shrinks the H zone, which is normally composed of myosin tail. So eventually, there is nowhere else for the thin filament to go, and the amount of tension is diminished. If a muscle is stretched to the point where thick and thin filaments do not overlap at all, then obviously no cross bridges can be formed, and no tension is produced in the sarcomere. So this percent of the sarcomere length that is overlapped is going to determine how much tension is produced in the muscle. And you can see on this diagram here that sarcomeres produce maximum tension when the thick and thin filament overlap between about 80 to 120%. Anything less will reduce tension, anything more will reduce tension. A single action potential from a motor neuron will produce a single contraction in the muscle fiber of its motor unit. This isolated contraction is called a twitch, and a twitch can last for a few milliseconds or even longer depending on the muscle type. The tension that's produced by a single twitch can be measured using a myogram. And a myogram is just an instrument that measures the amount of tension that is produced over a period of time. This is kind of a picture of a myogram. Each twitch undergoes 3 phases. The first phase is a latent period during which the action potential is being propagated or sent along the sarcolemma, and the calcium ions are released into the sarcoplasmic reticulum. This is the phase during which excitation and contractions are being coupled, but before contraction has actually yet occurred. The contraction phase occurs next, and this is going to be when the calcium ions in the sarcoplasm have bound to the troponin, the tropomyosin has shifted away from the actin binding sites, cross bridges form, and the sarcomeres are actively shortening to the point of peak tension. The last phase then is the relaxation phase, when tension decreases as the contraction stops. Calcium ions will be pumped out of the sarcoplasm into the sarcoplasmic reticulum, the cross-bridge cycling stops, and the muscle fiber returns to its resting rate. Although a person can experience a muscle twitch, a single twitch does not produce any significant muscle activity in a living body. A series of action potentials to the muscle fibers is necessary to produce a muscle contraction that can produce work. So we need to go through these stages, or we need to have several action potentials in order to actually generate a contraction that produces work. Although a person can experience a muscle twitch, a single twitch does not produce any significant muscle activity in a living body. Basically, a series of action potentials to the muscle fibers is required to produce the muscle contraction that can produce work. So normal muscle contractions are a lot more sustained than a single twitch, and it can be modified by input from the nervous system to produce varying amounts of force. And this is called a graded muscle response. It occurs when a muscle contracts with different degrees of force based on certain circumstances, and it's caused by the frequency of action potentials from a motor neuron. How many action potentials are they getting over and over again? And then the number of motor neurons that are actually transmitting action potential. The rate at which a motor neuron fires action potential is going to affect the tension that's going to be produced in skeletal muscles. If all the fibers are stimulated while the previous twitch is still occurring, the second twitch will be stronger. And this response is called wave summation. You can see that on the diagram here. Because the excitation-contraction coupling effects of successive motor neurons signaling is summed or added together, as you get an action potential, you will generate more tension. So action potential, the first one generates this much tension, then the second one is going to add to that, generating that much tension, then the third one's going to add to that, generating that much more tension. If the frequency of motor neuron signaling increases, summation and then muscle tension in the motor unit continues to rise until it reaches a peak point, right? Here's our peak point. The tension at this point is about 3 to 4 times greater than the tension of a single twitch. This is called incomplete tetanus. So during incomplete tetanus, the muscle goes through quick cycles of contractions with short relaxation phases for each. If the stimulus frequency is too high or so high that the relaxation phase disappears completely, contractions become continuous in a process called tetanus. Okay, so this is showing wave summation and we hit our peak. This is showing tetanus where there's no relaxation period. You can see kind of the relaxation period on this graph, but during tetanus, there's no relaxation period. So during tetanus, the concentration of calcium ions in the sarcoplasm allows virtually all of the sarcomeres to cause cross-bridge and to shorten so that a contraction can continue uninterrupted until the muscle fatigues and can no longer produce tension. So that leads us to muscle tone then. Skeletal muscles are rarely completely relaxed. So if a muscle is not producing movement, it is contracted in a small amount to maintain its contractile proteins, and this is what's going to produce muscle tone. The tension produced by muscle tone allows muscles to continually stabilize our joints and to maintain posture. So even if you're not actively using your muscles are still contracted a tiny little bit in order to help maintain its proteins and to maintain our posture. And this is what leads to muscle tone. Muscle tone is accomplished by a very complex interaction between the nervous system and the skeletal muscles that results in the activation of a few motor units at a time. And in this manner, these muscles then never fatigue completely, as some motor units can recover while others are active. So it's kind of like a tag team that allows this continuous muscle tone to occur. In the absence of low-level contractions that lead to muscle tone, we have a situation called hypotonia or atrophy, and can result from damages to parts of the central nervous system, like in the cerebellum, or from loss of nerve activity to skeletal muscle. Hypotonic muscles are going to have a very flaccid or weak appearance and display functional impairments such as very weak reflexes. Now you can have the opposite of that and have a very high muscle tone, which is excessive muscle tone, hypertonia, and this is going to lead to muscle rigidity and muscle spasms because these muscles are contracted more than they should be for longer. Typically, hypertonia is going to be the result of damage to upper motor neurons in the central nervous system. And this is going to be seen in diseases like Parkinson's disease, where you have that muscle rigidity and that muscle spasms that occur that are very symptomatic of that particular disorder.